Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Rachel Pye. I'm the Head of Psychology at the University of Reading, Malaysia. Thank you for being here today. Let me introduce our speaker. Professor Helen Dodd has a PhD in Cognitive Science from Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. She joined the University of Reading in 2013 and is currently a Professor of Child Psychology in the Anxiety and Depression in Young People, known as ANDI, research unit. Her research looks at the risk factors and underlying mechanisms of child anxiety, with the aim to reduce or prevent its development. In 2019, Helen was awarded a prestigious UKRI Future Leaders Fellowship to look at whether adventurous play can be used to decrease children's anxiety risk. Helen's research has been funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, the Royal Society, British Academy and Australian Research Council. She's received awards from the Anxiety and Depression Association of America and the British Psychological Society, and currently holds an honorary position at the Centre for Emotional Health at Macquarie University, Australia. We're delighted to host her talk today as the first in our month of centenary celebrations, and we're delighted to see so many people here today. Details of our other events can be found on our website and will be listed at the end of the talk. Helen will speak for around 50 minutes and then take questions. Please feel free to ask questions as we go along in the Q&A tab, and I will put these to Helen at the end. So Helen, over to you.
Okay, so thanks very much for the invitation to speak today. I'm going to be talking about play as an antidote to anxiety in children and young people. So firstly, I thought I might start by thinking about what is play? What do we mean when we talk about play? So often when we think about play, we think of it as kind of something that's frivolous that people, children in particular, do in their spare time, in the gaps between doing other things that we might consider more meaningful. So it might be what they do when they come home from school before they go out and do a club, for example. It might be what they do during a break in a school day. But actually, I hope to be able to convince you today that play is much more than that and offers much more than that and is more important than that. And in fact, it might surprise you to know that play is actually a protected right of the child under the UN Convention for the Rights of the Child. So what is play? There's lots and lots of definitions of play. There are whole books written about what exactly play is. I quite like this definition, that it's what children and young people do when they're not being told what to do. So when we're not structuring their lives as adults and saying you should do this or you should do this or this is what we've got planned for you, it's what children do with their spare time. And that's really important, that it's led by children. So it's what they want to do. It's whatever they want to do that they enjoy doing. And so a question that quite often comes up when I talk about play is, what about older children? What about adults? Do we still play? And my answer to that is yes. I think, we still do things just for the sake of doing them, just because we enjoy doing them, not for any particular purpose, but just for fun. So I know during the lockdown in the UK, and I imagine it's the same in Malaysia, lots of people have been doing kind of Zoom calls online with friends and quizzes, games, activities, those kind of things online. To keep ourselves entertained and to keep that social connection. And that is play. Okay, we're adults, but we're doing it not for any reason other than it feels good and we enjoy doing it. And play can take place anywhere. So it takes place whenever or wherever opportunities arise. And that's a really important point, that opportunity is necessary. So when we're thinking as adults about the importance of play for children and about creating play opportunities, we need to make sure those opportunities are there. So children need the space and time to be able to play. If we structure all of their lives, there's no time left for play and they therefore won't play. So play is a fundamental right that children have, and we need to make sure that children have opportunity to do it. So free play is this kind of play where there are no kind of rules, there's no direction, there's no real purpose that's been set by an adult. So sometimes we use play in education, and so a teacher or an educator might have very carefully planned out, we're going to use play to learn a particular thing. That's not free play, that's structured play. It's really a really effective way of helping children to learn, but it's not free play because we've planned what children will do. Free play happens when children decide what they want to do and they have the space and opportunity to lead that play. So adults, when children are playing freely, should only join the play when they're invited to do so, and should only get involved in the play if the child asks them to join in. So free play is led by children. A child might say to you, come join in with me, we're going to do this, and you should always let the child then lead the play. When they do that, they really, really enjoy it. It's brilliant to take a step back and let children lead the play and see how much enjoyment they get from it. It can increase a child's sense of control because they are choosing what it is that they want to do. So particularly at times like these, where children are having a lot of control taken away from them because of COVID and because of restrictions, free play can be really helpful for increasing that sense of control, that I'm choosing what I do and what happens in this bit of space and time. Free play is really helpful as well for helping children to make sense of things. So often we find that children bring themes of what's going on in their lives into their play. And so they're using play to help them to process what it is that they're hearing, what it is that's going on around them. So it can be really helpful in that sense. And also helping them to express themselves. If they feel angry, if they feel sad, if they feel scared, they can express those emotions sometimes through their play in a way that they might not feel able to just in their talking or verbal communication. The other really nice thing about free play is that it can really support relationships and the development of relationships, because a child will learn that they can trust you and that you're interested in what they're doing if they're leading the play and you're joining them but allowing them to lead. So free play can be really beneficial, and I think particularly at times like these where children don't have a huge sense of control and where all of those relationships might feel a little bit more strained than they usually do because of the amount of time and stress that we're spending together as families, and the amount of stress that's on people because of the COVID restrictions. So in terms of kind of the evidence, what do we know about play and reducing stress and negative emotion? Lots of research has looked at this in the context of children who are hospitalised, because obviously when children are in hospital, they're restricted in terms of the play that they can do, and it can be quite a stressful situation for them. And so there's some nice research showing that when we do these kind of free play interventions in hospitals, that children benefit from those. So one study showed that when hospitalised children are given time for free play, then their stress decreases. And then another showed that children who are admitted to hospital for treatment show lower levels of anxiety and fewer negative emotions when they take part in a play intervention. So there's a good kind of evidence base that if we introduce play and give children time for play when they're in stressful situations, that reduces these kind of feelings of anxiety and stress. So in addition, probably so far as I've been talking, you've been thinking about play in terms of like a child sat at home with some toys, or perhaps playing in the garden. But play can take place in all sorts of places, and actually play outdoors and play in nature can be particularly beneficial. So we know that natural environments reduce what we call physiological markers of stress. So that means things like, blood pressure, how fast your heart's beating, those kind of things, that when you're in natural environments, when you're surrounded by trees, when you walk on grass, when you're near the ocean or at the beach, those markers of stress come down. And that's for everybody. So for adults, for children, being in nature is beneficial and decreases stress. And so if we know that play is beneficial and we know being in nature is beneficial, then if we can take that play into nature, then we get a kind of double hit of this benefit for stress. And also what's really important, I think, is that children's stress and children's anxiety is closely linked to how their parents are feeling. So if you as parents or you as educators can take children into nature, then your stress will come down too, and the children will benefit from that as well. We also know that when we kind of what we call green play spaces, so if you take a play space that's very kind of artificial, very modern, without any nature in it, and you nature it or you green it, so you fill it, you know, put lots of plants in, put in areas where children can mess about with mud and get dirty. If you do those things to children's play spaces, then you see all sorts of benefits. So these kind of play spaces encourage more complex and diverse play. Children play for longer when they've got these nature elements in their play space. They're also more physically active, which of course is really good for their physical health, and it improves their attention. So having this time outdoors in these play spaces, when they go back into the classroom, their attention is better. So sometimes people think that kind of play is kind of the other side of sort of formal education, and it's like an either or decision. And that's really not the case. Actually, what we see is that the more that children play, the more opportunity they have to be in nature, then the better prepared they are for a more formal learning environment as well. And they learn lots whilst they're playing. So it's really not an either or decision. Play really benefits children in terms of their educational development as well. And these opportunities to kind of get muddy, get their hands dirty, get into nature can be really, really beneficial. And we mustn't forget them in place of kind of just a very rigid sort of education, formal indoor sort of system. So we know being outdoors and being in nature are good for children's mental health. There's evidence that the more time children spend outdoors, the better their mental health is. So let's think about play, let's think about being outdoors, let's think about being in nature if we want to support children's mental health broadly. Now, I wanted to share this with you. This is a quote from a child in the UK. We have a sort of children's news show called Newsround. I'm not sure if you have something similar in Malaysia or whether you can watch it from there, but it's a children's news show, and they have a website and on the website children can comment on different news stories. And this is a comment that was on their website from a child. And so our playgrounds in England were closed for quite a while, and one of the children commented, "I think it's rather sad that playgrounds have shut because it can give me a chance to breathe." And I think that really nicely captures what play is to children and what these spaces, these child-led spaces, mean to kids. It's a place for them to be children, to feel that kind of, sense of, right, I've got some space, I can breathe, I can relax. And it's not about the pressure and the formal, assessment education. It's a place for them to be children. And therefore, it's a place that really is promoting their mental health. So what I wanted to talk about in a bit more detail today is a particular type of play, which I call adventurous play, and how that might be linked to children's risk for anxiety in particular. And so we've recently published a kind of quite detailed, theoretical model about how adventurous play might reduce children's risk for anxiety. The title of the paper is just there. That's freely available to everybody. If you just Google it, you can find it if you really want to read it. It's quite a long beast of a paper. But what I'd like to do over the next kind of 15-20 minutes is take you through the sort of main points of that paper, which really is kind of getting you to think about why do we care about children's anxiety? Why should we think about that? And why is it that adventurous play might be particularly well placed to support and prevent anxiety in children? Okay, so I have to apologise that these figures are from England. I wasn't able to find easily similar figures from Malaysia. But in England, what we've seen is that between 2004 and 2017, we found a 49% increase in emotional disorders in 5 to 15-year-olds. So it's really striking, this increase in emotional disorders. So mental health problems in children are getting worse. Of those, anxiety disorders are the most common. So we're seeing this increase in mental health problems broadly, and anxiety disorders in particular are the most common. And of course, these are pre-pandemic figures. So actually, this survey was done again in July 2020, and they found a further 50% increase in emotional disorders in children and young people. So, we don't know long term what the mental health effects of the pandemic are going to be, but I think it's very clear that it hasn't been good for children's mental health. And even before the pandemic, things weren't looking great. My understanding from a quick look at the situation in Malaysia is that similar patterns are going on there, and that there are quite high rates of mental health problems in children and young people in Malaysia as well. So anxiety is the most common emotional disorder. It's also what we call a gateway disorder, which it means it's often the first mental health problem that an individual will experience. So they might have anxiety as young children that might turn into anxiety and depression during adolescence, and it has long-term kind of negative outcomes for mental health, and other negative outcomes as well, like things like substance abuse. We can treat anxiety in children quite effectively, and so if children get help when they're younger, it's not then things can be much better in the long term. But what's important is that if we don't do anything about it, we don't prevent it, and we don't support children who are experiencing anxiety, then they are at risk for these longer term problems. So it isn't something that's trivial. We do need to take it seriously when children are experiencing significant anxiety. And we know from research that I've done and many others that pathways to anxiety begin early in life. So we can detect from about age 3 or 4 that some children are already at risk for anxiety disorders. So those pathways, that trajectory that leads to anxiety and to longer term mental health problems, is really beginning quite early. And so what we really need to be thinking about is how can we ensure that young children are growing up in an environment which is meeting their needs and allows them to thrive, and make sure that they're not on that trajectory which is leading to longer term mental health problems. So I'm going to go through now in a bit of detail some specific factors that are related to anxiety. So I'm going to talk about coping, so coping expectations or maladaptive coping. I'm going to talk about intolerance of uncertainty, anxiety sensitivity or the misinterpretation of arousal, and I'm going to talk about avoidance. So I'll explain what each of these things mean as I go. But what I want to do is explain, that these are factors. There are many other factors that are linked to anxiety, but these ones I want to talk about in particular because I think they are factors that might be able to be targeted via adventurous play. So first, thinking about coping. So we know when we look at anxious children and we compare them with children who are not anxious, that anxious children use more maladaptive and less adaptive coping skills in response to negative life events. So when things go wrong in life, anxious children cope in a way that's not effective, that doesn't help them, that potentially makes them feel worse. Whereas non-anxious children are more likely to use coping skills that actually are beneficial and support their recovery from that negative thing that's happened. We also know that anxious children are less likely to think that they would be able to cope in some hypothetical future situation. So if say, imagine you're in this situation and this thing's happened, how would you feel? How would you cope? And anxious children think, I won't be able to cope with that. That would be awful. I'd feel terrible. And Phil Kendall, who's one of the kind of pioneers of child anxiety treatment, describes that an effective treatment is one that leads the child to acquire what's called a coping template. So that's the idea that they have a kind of a template or a sort of roadmap, if you like, of how to cope in different situations. I know I can cope because I'll do these things. This is what would happen if I was in that situation. Okay. So what we really ideally want to do is not to be giving children that during their treatment, but to be supporting children to grow up already with that kind of coping template established, that they know how to cope effectively in different situations and therefore anticipate that they will be able to cope in the future. We also know that when we treat child anxiety, when children's coping improves, then their anxiety improves. So coping is really important for sort of distinguishing between anxious and non-anxious children, but also in terms of what we need to focus on in treatment to support children to become less anxious. Okay, so now let's talk about intolerance and uncertainty. I'll bring all these things together in a minute, but I'm speaking about each one of them individually first. So intolerance and uncertainty is kind of exactly what it says. So it's how well you can cope with or tolerate uncertainty. So some people are really happy with uncertainty and they're quite comfortable with it. Some people quite like it. Other people really, really do not like uncertainty, and being in an uncertain situation is something that's really aversive for them. So those people would be described as being intolerant of uncertainty. So they might ask lots of questions, they might avoid situations where there's uncertainty, and it can then be problematic and lead to excessive worrying and anxiety in situations where they actually have to be exposed to uncertainty. And we know that children and adults who are high in intolerance of uncertainty are also more likely to be anxious and more likely to worry. So IU is associated with anxiety and worry, very broadly speaking, and it's robustly associated with anxiety and worry in children and adolescents as well. We also know that when treatments for anxiety change intolerance of uncertainty, so people become more tolerant of uncertainty, then that reduces their symptoms of anxiety. So again, we're seeing this association with anxiety, and we know that in treatment, if we change it, then that decreases anxiety. So that's good evidence that this kind of construct of this ability to cope with uncertainty is important for anxiety. Okay, so now let's think about physiological arousal. What does that mean? That means your heart racing really fast, when you're blushing, when your hands are sweating, when you've got butterflies in your stomach. I think most of us can appreciate that there have been times when we've felt those feelings, and it's very normal for our bodies to feel that way when we feel anxious. It's kind of, in a way, our body's preparing for that sort of fight or flight response. But sometimes what happens when people experience physiological arousal is that they misinterpret it. So that misinterpretation sometimes is catastrophic. So they think when my heart beats really fast, or when I get those butterflies in my tummy, that means that something terrible is happening. So it might be that I think I'm having a heart attack when I feel my heart beating like that. So anxiety sensitivity refers to that kind of fear of fear. So being scared of those bodily sensations, being scared of anxiety and worry in itself. When people are high in anxiety sensitivity, they're more likely to have an anxiety disorder. And it also predicts anxiety over time. So we know if we take an adult or a child who is high in anxiety sensitivity, so they panic about those feelings, so that, you know, their heart racing or whatever, that they're more likely to experience anxiety over time. Okay, and again, when we look at treatment, we know that if we change anxiety sensitivity, it leads to improvements in anxiety. Okay, and then the final thing that kind of brings everything together, and to some extent, is avoidance. So children who are avoidant of things that make them feel anxious, of things that are uncertain, are sometimes what's called behaviourally inhibited children. So that's a kind of temperament style. It's children who don't like new things, you know, tend to kind of retreat to their parents if somebody new walks into the room. They don't like going to new places, they don't like uncertain things. And you can see this sort of temperament style quite early in life, but what characterises it really is that they're avoidant of things. So they try not to have to be exposed to things that are new or unfamiliar to them. And this is one of the highest risk factors for anxiety disorders. But what we know is that that risk also is exaggerated when parents support the child in their avoidance. So if you have a child who's behaviourally inhibited and they say, I don't want to go to so-and-so's house after school today because I've never been there before and that's too scary for me. If as a parent you say, oh, you know, that's fine, don't worry, you just don't have to go. And you know, that's one particular example where it might be okay, but if every time the child wants to avoid something, the parent says, it's okay, don't worry, you stay here with me. If that happens, then that increases the risk for anxiety longer term. So what we do when we do early intervention or prevention programs for anxiety is we really try and target that avoidance. So to try and stop the child from avoiding things, because they need to be exposed to things in order to learn that they can cope and to learn about uncertainty, etc. And we work with parents to try and stop parents from supporting that avoidance. So it's not about pushing a child to do something they don't want to do, but kind of gentle encouragement to get them to do something rather than always saying, oh, it's fine, you don't have to, you don't have to, you don't have to. And when we do treatment, that exposure to things that are a little bit anxiety provoking is central to making sure that the treatment is effective. So, you know, I think most of us know intuitively, for example, if you fall off a bike and you feel scared of riding your bike again, the most important thing to do is to expose yourself to that. So to get back on the bike and try again. If you carry on avoiding getting on the bike, you will continue to fear the bike and you won't ever learn that actually you don't need to be scared of the bike. So avoidance is really central to understanding why people become anxious and what maintains that anxiety. You have to face things that you fear in order to learn that things aren't as scary as they might be. So avoidance removes opportunities for learning. Okay, you don't learn anything about the so-called the object that you might be fearing if you avoid it. Okay, so it removes the opportunity to learn to cope and to build a coping template that we talked about before. It removes opportunity to decrease that intolerance of uncertainty, because in order to learn to be tolerant of uncertainty, you need to be exposed to uncertainty. And it removes opportunity to change that anxiety sensitivity. Okay, so we talked about coping, we talked about coping with intolerance of uncertainty, and we talked about anxiety sensitivity. So to learn to cope, children need to be exposed to situations where they have to cope. Okay, to decrease intolerance of uncertainty, children need to be exposed to situations where they experience uncertainty. And to change anxiety sensitivity, children need to be exposed to situations where they feel physiological arousal. Okay, so what I'm proposing is adventurous play, which is kind of exciting play, thrilling play, where the child experiences a level of fear. You know, it's not about being terrified, because that's not fun anymore, but a bit of a level of fear, and is able to take age appropriate risks. So something might be, you know, an example might be riding a bike really fast down a hill. It might be jumping from a rock into a pool to go swimming. It might be what these boys are doing. It might be skateboarding. It might be climbing up a tree. It's that play that's at the edge of the comfort zone. Okay, where the child is happy to do it, but they are experiencing a bit of fear and a bit of, I'm not too sure. But what's really important is the child leads it. So if we push children to do it, then it's just terrifying. If they do it themselves, if they choose to do it, then they won't push themselves too far. And so here are some nice pictures of children doing things that I would consider to be adventurous play. This is at a school. It shows children climbing up and jumping off an old tree. And also on a school playground, you can see the children have made this car. They're outside, they're playing in the rain and pulling each other around and exploring and making things. They're all different types of adventurous play. So what I think is that adventurous play provides a positive context, because children like doing it. It's fun, right? Children naturally do this. And it's a positive context where children are motivated to engage in situations where they might experience some fear. Okay, so they might experience some uncertainty, some physiological arousal, and they might need to cope with those feelings. So it provides natural exposures and an opportunity to learn about physiological arousal, about coping, and about uncertainty. And as I've already described, we know that these things are really important for prevention and treatment of anxiety. So if children are growing up with plenty of opportunities to play in an adventurous way, then they will be better equipped to cope. They won't be intolerant of uncertainty. They'll understand physiological arousal in itself is not anything to be scared of. And that should prevent them from experiencing kind of overwhelming anxiety in other situations as they get older. So it provides that kind of context that I talked about earlier for children to be on the right trajectory rather than starting off life on that wrong trajectory where they're headed towards anxiety and longer term mental health problems. So I wanted to show you this video. I'm not entirely sure that it's going to work. What I might do is maybe put the link in the chat, or is there a way we could share the link later, Rachel? Yeah. Because I'm worried if I try and play it now, it might all go horribly wrong. But what this video shows, just so that you know when you watch it later on, hopefully, it's from an adventure playground in London, which has been there since the 1950s. And it shows a video of an obstacle course. So the children have created this obstacle course using a zip wire, a shopping trolley, various other bits and pieces. And I think it just really nicely shows what adventurous play looks like. So these children, I think there's 3 or 4 of them, it's led by them. They've decided that they want to do it. They're working together. There's lots of kind of screaming and because it is a bit scary. They're going down this ramp on a shopping trolley, and then they're kind of having to dodge some other things. But also you can see that they're really enjoying it. At one point, one of the children loses her shoe, and the rest of them say, just keep going, you can do it. And it really shows, I think, this, idea that they're being exposed to uncertainty, that they're experiencing this physiological arousal, and that they're having to learn to cope. But also that it's really, really fun, and that both sides of this are really important. The fact is that kids like playing in this way, so we have an opportunity to help prevent anxiety and improve their mental health, but via something that they're motivated to do and they want to do and that they enjoy. Okay, so also just kind of, I guess, touching on that, here are some quotes from children about this type of play and what they think and how they experience it. So one said, I did it once and I did okay, and I felt happy and scared at the same time. I couldn't stop myself. To get this idea of this motivation, like they really want to do it. They do feel happy, they do feel a bit scared, but they want to do it and they want to give it another go. You feel excited because you're out of your comfort zone, but you're enjoying yourself. I feel free and confident and on top of the world because I'm really high. And I think these are really nice quotes for capturing just how children experience those moments. And I think, if we think back, or even as adults, we experience these moments where something is challenging and you are at the edge of your comfort zone and you do feel a bit anxious, but then they can be really rewarding as well when you do them and when you get through it. So that's how children experience this kind of play, that it's playing at the edges of their comfort zone, working out what's too much for me. And I was recently at a play park place that had 3 slides that were all quite high, but they kind of went up in height. And I was watching children kind of go up and look and try and decide which slide was too high for them, which one did they want to go down. And so they might start at the middle one and then decide, oh, actually this one's too high for me, and come down to the one below. Or they might start in the middle one and look down and think, actually I can go higher and go up. But it was really interesting watching them adjust. What's the right level for me? Where do I want to be? And I think that's what they were doing, is they were trying to get themselves to the edge of their comfort zone so that they could experience this kind of excited, scared feeling, or what has also been called a scary, funny emotion. So this idea that children need to play in this way in order to grow up with good mental health isn't new. We like to talk about it quite a lot in our media in the UK, at least. This is an article from a few years ago from The Guardian. This idea that by kind of overprotecting or mollycoddling our children, we're fueling mental illness for later on, because we don't allow them this exposure to the sort of the anxiety-provoking situations when they're young. And also other people have written about it. Peter Gray's written a few articles about this idea that children are playing less and less. Children play outdoors less and less, they're in nature less and less, and at the same time we're seeing this increase in children's mental health problems. We don't know necessarily that these things are linked, because lots of other things have changed over the last few decades, but we can't deny that these things have happened at the same time. We don't prioritise play for children anymore, and the amount of time children are playing is declining, and we also are faced with really high rates of mental health problems. So it's possible that these things are linked, right? And also it's been written about in terms of kind of from an evolutionary perspective, that these types of thrilling experiences are needed to prevent us from developing phobias. So this is where I'd really like to have data from Malaysia, for those of you who are in Malaysia, but yeah, I'm not sure whether it exists, but I definitely couldn't find it easily. So this is data from England, I apologise for that, but this is data showing the amount of time children spend playing indoors versus outdoors over the space of a generation. So it's from children in 2009. So, you know, it's a decade or so old now. But at that point, their parents were saying they spent about 40% of their time, their sort of playtime, spent playing outdoors. And children in 2009 were spending around 10% of their time playing outdoors. So you can see this quite significant reduction in the amount of time children are spending playing outdoors. And remember, at the same time, we're seeing 50% increase in mental health problems. And this I find quite staggering, but in 2015, 1.3 million children in the UK spent no time in natural spaces, according to this survey for Natural England. So that is, a relatively small proportion, but over 1 million children not spending any time in nature. And when I've already spoken about the benefits of nature for children's mental health, for adults' mental health. And if this many children are not having any contact with nature, again, is it a surprise that actually we're seeing these huge increases in mental health problems? And also, this is also data from England, that they found that 5% of schools had banned children from playing tag because of health and safety concerns. So they were worried that children might run too fast and fall over, they might grab hold of each other or hurt each other in some way. And I don't know what childhood looks like in Malaysia right now, or even for the previous generation. But I know when I was a child in school, playing tag was basically the sort of #1 playground game. So the idea that children now are not even being allowed to play in that way, which is just a kind of instinctive chasing each other around the playground way, I think we really need to question whether we're creating an environment which maps onto what children need. And we should also remember, it's not my area of expertise, but that we also are facing physical health problems in children in terms of obesity and things. So if we're preventing children from running around and chasing each other, are we doing the best that we could be doing in terms of helping support their physical health as well? So what I'm working on at the moment, I have some funding from the UK government for a 7-year programme of work, which is to evaluate whether increasing children's adventurous play has a positive effect on their anxiety symptoms and their risk for anxiety disorder. So it's quite a big project. We're about 2 years into that. So I don't have the answers right now. I'm working with a range of organisations and doing some really exciting work over the coming years in terms of how we might increase adventurous play. We're doing work with parents about what the barriers to that are, and really thinking about how can we increase adventurous play, and then looking at, when we do, what does that do for children's mental health? So kind of watch this space in terms of findings around that. I also thought, given the current context, there were likely to be questions related to COVID, mental health related to the pandemic, and play related to the pandemic. So I just included a few slides here on that before we finish up and go to Q&A. So I already mentioned right at the beginning, in England we have this mental health survey which happens at regular waves. And in July 2020, another wave of that was conducted. And what they found is that 1 in 6 5 to 16-year-olds were above the cutoff to suggest that they had a mental health problem. And that is a further 50% increase since that 2017 figure that I talked about earlier. So it was clear that July 2020, children in England were not doing okay. What we don't know, of course, is how many of those children will kind of bounce back once life goes back to normal and they can go back to school, etc. And how many of those children will have longer term mental health problems as a result of things that have happened during the pandemic. So this figure here, this picture, shows some data from a project that I've been involved in, where we've tracked attention, emotional and behavioural problems in children over time. So from March 2020, when we first went into lockdown here, up to February 2021, when we were in our another lockdown. Sorry, I was trying to remember where we're at. And so what you can see here quite nicely is that when, and this is mental health problems or SDQ scores. So during the first lockdown, children's mental health got worse. So their scores problem scores go up. Then as the summer came and restrictions were eased, mental health problems go down. Then we had local restrictions put in, which increased things a little bit. And then we had a new lockdown and things, the mental health problems got worse again. And so you can really see there, I think, the impact of lockdowns on children's mental health. Of course, you know, what I said before applies, that you can see here, some kids just get better, right? All they need is for lockdown to end, for summer to come, and they're feeling better again. And so it's not the case that every child who's had difficulties during lockdown, you know, is doomed for life. Like, lots of them will be fine. But there is no doubt when you look at this data that lockdown is bad for children's mental health. So let's have a think about play during lockdown. Play is a really interesting thing. I've spent, you know, so much of the past year talking about play and lockdown and COVID and things, because lots of children have played more because they're not in school. They've had more time to play. They spent more time playing with their siblings, more time perhaps playing in the garden. But at the same time, children are restricted in what they can do in their play. So they're restricted in where they can go, and they're significantly restricted in who they can play with because of the social restrictions related to COVID. So whilst, yes, children may have had more opportunity to play, they've missed out on the full range of play, and that social play that children do with peers is really, really crucial for helping them, you know, learn social skills, to learn about things like sharing, and to develop those relationships. And something that I've observed just anecdotally, now that children here can play together again, is that for some of them, they aren't really quite sure how to do it anymore. And it's a bit like, oh, what do we do? What do we? And they've grown, you know, young children have developed hugely in the past year, 15 months, and changed. And now they need to work out, how do I play with a friend now that I'm like this? So yes, they may have been playing more, but we mustn't forget that they're missing out on their social play, and actually that offers them really, really important learning opportunities in terms of their social skills, and a really important outlet for their sort of emotional well-being as well. So this is some data here from an early years survey that was done by some colleagues at the University of Limerick, and they found increases in screen time, unsurprisingly, but also increases in outdoor play during lockdown in the UK, or in Ireland actually, of course. And I think, you know, that reflects my experience as a parent, and I'm sure lots of you can relate to that as well, that yes, there's more opportunity to play outdoors, but yes, also probably more time just spent playing on screens. Interestingly, in that survey, they found that 1 in 3 children were reported to have brought the virus or restrictions related to COVID into their play. So these pictures here are actually of my own children from April last year, where they created this game on the pavement outside our house called Splat the Virus. And they've drawn, using chalk, some kind of virus blobs. And it's a bit like hopscotch, the way they designed it. So you kind of jump from one to the next. And they decided that they wanted to draw it on the pavement outside the house so that when other children were walking with their families, they could play on it as well. And the idea is basically you're splatting the virus, you're jumping on each virus blob. And I thought this was fascinating, this idea that they kind of created this game around the virus. And that prompted me to set up a kind of archive where other people could give examples of how their children have brought the virus or restrictions into their play. So these are some nice examples that I was sent as part of that archive work. So you can see in the left-hand picture, this is a child who has socially distanced all of the toys that she's playing with. So you can see they're all fairly evenly spaced and not in each other's space. This one was from a nursery teacher who observed that children were wanting to put masks over their dolls. And then these two here, this is a brother and sister who normally on a Sunday go to swimming lessons, and then they go to a coffee shop and have cake afterwards. And so on Sunday they couldn't go to their swimming lessons, so they recreated it at home. So the first picture is that here is them sat in their car driving to swimming, and then the second is them on their chairs practicing their swimming. And then afterwards their mum gave them some cake, and so they kind of recreated their normal routine, but at home. And this is something actually that we were saying as advice to people, is to try and kind of keep your routine as similar as possible to normal. And it's fascinating that these children knew that that's what they needed to do and just led it and did it by themselves. Which brings me right back to where I started really, which is when we allow children to lead the play, they often use the play to help them express how they're feeling and make sense of what's going on around them. So I've been involved in a group called Play First UK, where we've been campaigning that, you know, play needs to be prioritised and mental health needs to be prioritised as we come out of lockdown. The reason for that being that children, as I said, have had their play with their peers restricted hugely. And we know that play helps children to process what's gone on and help them recover from stress and from trauma. And so if we put children back into a classroom, put lots of pressure on them to do academic catch up, when they're still struggling with what's going on, they've missed their friends and their mental health isn't great, all we're going to do is make their mental health worse in the long run. And we know that poor mental health is related to poor educational outcomes. So what we think should be happening is that we think about what children need first. How do we support their mental health? How do we support them to reconnect with their friends, support their social and emotional development, so that when they then are back in the classroom, they're in a position where they're ready to learn and to maximise that input that's coming in terms of supporting their educational catch up. But if we don't look after their mental health first, in the long run, we end up with children who don't attain as well in terms of their educational attainment and who have poor mental health, which none of us want. So as part of that work, we're campaigning at the moment for a summer of play. So these are some of the supporters of that campaign. So working with lots and lots of charities and organisations who've come together to really try and make sure that over this summer there is funding and opportunity and support for children to be playing, to being outdoors, being in nature, being physically active and reconnecting with their friends. Okay, so I wanted to finish up with just some kind of practical tips, I guess, in terms of what you can do if you're supporting children at home or if you're supporting children in a school. You know, the situation is different all over the world in terms of what stage of lockdown or where COVID is at and vaccination programs and things. But I think that, you know, hopefully these pieces of advice apply almost regardless of what situation you're in. So the first thing, which I already mentioned, is keeping routines in place as much as possible. So try and keep things feeling something like normal, or establishing new routines. But it's important for children and young people to know what's going to happen rather than like there is no routine anymore, because that can feel really, really uncertain and be quite unsettling for them. Provide lots of opportunities for free play. I talked right at the beginning about the benefits of that. Try and resist structuring all of your child's time or the children who you're working with time. Give them time when they can just work out what they want to do. It's okay for them to be a bit bored for a while. Let them explore, find something to do, because that free play may be the thing that helps them to cope and process what's going on. It can also really stimulate creativity and things. And if they say to you during that time, do you want to come and join in with me? Brilliant, go for it. But let them invite you rather than you leading the play. That allows them opportunity to have control, but also look out for other opportunities where you can give them some sense of control, like choosing what's for dinner, choosing, you know, what movie you watch that evening. Anywhere where children can have a bit of control will make them feel a bit better. Look out for kids, you know, particularly if you're working in education, if children are struggling with free play, which some children do, and gently support that. So you can kind of give some prompts to play. So get out a few different toys and let them choose from those things. And so they're still having that choice and still having that control. But some children get a bit overwhelmed if they've got everything to choose from and it's too much. We may need to adjust our age expectations a bit. Lots of children have regressed and kind of gone back in their development a little bit. So what you might expect from, you know, a 6-year-old, you may not get from a 6-year-old right now. particularly, you know, if you're working in education and children have been out of education for a while, if they're coming back in, you know, what you might expect from that age group you may not be getting, particularly in terms of independence and social friendship development, that kind of thing. Look out for behaviour that might be communicating, a child's way of communicating that they're not doing okay, that things are hard, that they continue to be hard. So often when children are doing something which we're like, oh, why are they doing that? Why can't they just do this? They're trying to tell us something, they're trying to communicate something. So rather than going straight to being cross and to discipline, stop and think about, might this be an indicator that something else is going on, that they want to have a chat, that this is really rubbish for them and they need a hug. Look after your own well-being too. The number one predictor of children having mental health problems is poor parent mental health. So take the time that you need to support yourself as well. That's not selfish, that's in your child's best interest too. Provide as much outdoor time as you can. I know that that's challenging when there are restrictions in place, but if there is opportunity to be outdoors and the weather allows it, get outdoors. Everybody feels better outdoors, and particularly looking for opportunities to be in nature. Okay, that brings me to the end. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Actually, Helen, do you think that we could try and play the video? Do you want to give it a go?
Yeah, let's do that. I'll get it up. I need to find the link again.
And whilst Helen is looking for the video, please do feel free to ask any questions using the Q&A function. And also, I'd like to say thank you to Helen. This is quite a strange way to give a public lecture, so I will give you a round of applause on behalf of the 85 people who are listening.
Yeah, so strange, isn't it? Apologies for the dog and the child. It's typical that today's a day that school decides they're going to close, isn't it? Right, okay, I'm going to try this then. Okay, do you want to let me know when you can see it, and then I'll press play?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, let's give it a go then. I'll press play, but just interrupt me if you can't hear or if the noise is terrible or something.
This is our obstacle course that means, and here we go. 3, 2, 1! So we made an obstacle course. I mean, involved lots of dangerous bits. Let's just get started. Let's go!
Keep going.
Let's go, Noah! Come on! Elliot, go, Noah! Come on! Oh, I shoot! You better take...
Okay, did that work okay?
It did for me. I hope it did for the other audience.
Sorry. YouTube carried on playing. Yeah, I love that video because you can see, you know, they're just having a really good time, but also, you know, it's totally set up by them. They're in control. If at any point they're like, actually, this is too much and we want to stop, then they just can, because there isn't an adult there telling them this is what you have to do. And you can see, I think at one point one of the children says, oh, I'm feeling a bit scared now, and there is that like, it's exciting but it's a bit scary, but they all look really happy and they're enjoying it and they're supporting one another. And I just think if you think about uncertainty and coping and arousal, you can see all of those things happening in that couple of minutes of play. And I should also say, I guess, to people who are not used to seeing playgrounds that look like that, that it is intentionally a bit scruffy. Adventure playgrounds tend to be, they're very kind of child-led places where there's lots of mud and lots of sand, and they build different things, but everything's kind of temporary, so that the kids can shape and change what it is that they're playing on, and as a result they look like that, and they play with things like shopping trolleys and recycled tires and whatever they can get their hands on, and it is like heaven to children, even though often as adults I think we see those spaces and think, oh, it's a bit scruffy, and we quite like the look of a nice modern pristine playground, but actually that's not what children want or need. But I think, I just wanted to say that because I think particularly probably maybe people from Malaysia wouldn't be familiar with that type of playground.
Thanks, Helen. So we've had quite a few questions in. What I've done is I've grouped them into a theme. So we've got some about play, some about anxiety, some of practical advice, and a couple of miscellaneous ones at the end. So the play ones, the first question that came in was, how do you measure play? Is it self-report? How do you operationalize play?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. So actually quite a lot, I said I've got this 7-year program of work, quite a lot of that time is spent working out how on earth we measure play. So we've recently published results from a British Children's Play Survey, which is a national survey of how much children are playing in Britain, where they're playing, how adventurously they play, etc. And so for that, we developed a parent report measure, which just asks, on a typical week, how often would you go to this place, to these different places? How long would your child play for when they were there? And then we can kind of approximate how much time they'd be spending in different playing in different places. But that's not perfect. As I know as a parent, I'd be guessing, roughly it's about this. So it gives us an estimate. The other ways we can do it is by direct observation. So we're working at the moment to create a sort of observation tool that we can use on school playgrounds. So we can kind of try and capture the diversity of play that's happening. Because, if you stand on a school playground for a half-hour lunch break, nearly all of that will be play, but there are huge differences between schools in terms of the kind of quality of play that's happening. So some schools' children would just be kind of wandering around, maybe running around, maybe a few kids kicking a football, and in others there will be, kids in costume, putting on a play, climbing on things, building dens, having quite elaborate creative play. So I think, it depends on whether you mean, I guess we have to differentiate whether we mean the time that children spend playing or the types of play children are engaging in. So the survey is really about the time and nothing about the quality of play, whereas what we're trying to do in school playgrounds is capture the types of play that children are engaging in, particularly that adventurous play. Is that happening? Are they being exposed to kind of this uncertainty and arousal and things?
Brilliant, thanks. We've also got some questions asking for sort of further definition of play. So, is it what children do in their spare time? Would video games be considered play? Would reading? Would music? So perhaps you can talk a bit about what is and isn't play in these sorts of terms.
Yeah, definitely. The answer to that depends on who you ask. I tend to go with it's whatever kids want to do. So if what they want to do is read a book, if they want to play a musical instrument, if they want to play on Minecraft, then it's play. I think what's important though is, so we sometimes talk about this kind of like healthy diet of play. So we know with eating that if we, only ever ate Mars bars, that would be really bad for our health. And the same is true of play, that if children only ever play Minecraft, then that's pretty bad for their health. So what we want is this kind of balanced play diet where they're doing things that they enjoy, but there's diversity to them. So yes, some of the time that might be reading a book, and some of the time it might be playing, a musical instrument. but other times it should be being outdoors and being active and being adventurous and being in nature. Some of that might be screen-based play, but trying to kind of think about that diversity of play, and being really careful as adults, parents, teachers, that we don't go, oh, we've told them to read a book, or they know that between 4 and 5 o'clock they have to do reading, therefore what they're doing right now is playing. Like, they're not. If it's in their routine and they've been told they have to do it, or in their heads they have to do it between that time, then it's not play. If it's right, you can do anything you want, and what they really want to do is go and play the piano, then that is play. Does that make sense? But the more adult-led and structured it is, the less playful it is. So I think that playful can also be a useful word for that. So, you could play the piano and be very, very focused on, exactly, which notes you're playing and getting the music right. But you can also be quite playful and mess about. And what will it sound like if I do this? Or what does it sound if I play it really fast or play it differently? And that's more play-like than, doing something that's very sort of rigid and it has to be this way. Does that make sense? But I don't think that there's any benefit in saying to children, well, you can't read a book if that's what you really want to do. But also, it needs to be more than that. It shouldn't just be that all day and be like, oh, they're playing, so that's fine. Sorry.
Don't worry. I know that you got a lockdown puppy. We did too. Yeah. So, sorry, I'm just having a look. There's a couple of questions. I think this is quite an interesting one. When children are running around a shopping mall, what's your reaction? Is that play?
They're running around a shopping mall.
Mm-hmm. It's quite common in Malaysia.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. I mean, it is play. It's definitely play from a child's perspective. The only problem with that is, safety in terms of, and how much it might annoy other people, right? But for children, then they're just playing, and they would benefit from doing that. But I suppose we always have these kind of social constraints, like my children could go out and play a game of cricket in the middle of the road. But that's not a very sensible thing to do because the road is shared space and cars will be on it. That's a more extreme example, but there are places that are better suited for children to play and places that are not better suited. So it's play, and the kids are probably having a great time. And as long as it's not, actually putting anybody at risk, then I don't think it's problematic. But I can see that socially that might be quite difficult, particularly with, social distancing restrictions and things in place. If children are just kind of running around everywhere. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it does. I feel a bit mean for asking you that one, sorry. So moving on to some anxiety questions. One is about whether you think that the increase in anxiety is related to this growing urbanisation and a lack of green spaces. And I think, the differences in outdoor environments between Malaysia and the UK is probably quite relevant here. A lot of the social space, because it's so hot, social spaces tend to be shopping malls. And you don't see as many people playing out. And then you've got big conurbations like KL and JB, where perhaps, there isn't so much, they're very urban areas. So do you think that, what is the relationship there?
Yeah. It's a really, really difficult thing to prove, right? To get evidence of, because it's not just increasing urbanisation isn't the only change that's happened over the past generation or two. But I think they probably are related. I think that children's mental health is multiply determined, right? There's multiple things that affect children's mental health, and I don't think that any one of those things individually accounts for the increase in mental health problems. What I do think, though, is that at the moment, the world, the environment that children are growing up in is not very well matched to what children actually need. So it's things like the shopping mall example is actually really nice in that sense, that that's where children spend their time and that's where social space is. And yet I assume lots of people don't like children running around in shopping malls. Hence the question. So where is the space where children should be doing that, right? We should be creating environments which match children's needs. So children need space to run around and play. So where are they doing that? And if they are restricted from doing that, then there will be consequences. Okay, so if children are growing up in, you know, big cities, in small apartments without access to outdoor space, and there's no public outdoor space that they can access or where they feel welcomed and can express themselves and be totally free to play, then that will have a negative impact on their mental health. I'm fairly confident of that. So I guess the sort of big picture in terms of the work that I'm doing is thinking about prevention of mental health problems. And part of that prevention needs to be that we create an environment which supports children's mental health rather than the opposite. And the same is true of educational systems, that our education systems aren't necessarily designed to support children's mental health, right? They're designed for other things, but that's not the purpose isn't to make sure that children grow up with good mental health. And yet we know that childhood mental health is the #1 predictor of adult life satisfaction. But it's not often what we prioritise when we're doing things like urban planning, educational planning, etc. So it's quite a broad issue. I think it goes way beyond urban planning, but I definitely think, you know, urban planning which is child-centric can be incredible, and there are examples of that. But there are many, many, many more examples where children's needs are not really met in their sort of local neighbourhoods.
Thanks for that, Helen. I've got an eye on the time, so I'm not going to be able to get through everybody's questions, but I'll get through the ones that I think have been most commonly asked. We've got a couple of questions from one of our graduates from UORM Psychology, Car Hink, one of the few people not to be anonymous. And he was asking about underlying mechanisms around this being fearful of body reaction, so the things that you were talking about, the hypersensitivity, and also whether the effectiveness of adventurous play type therapies is reduced as children get older.
Okay, so in terms of interpretation of arousal, so part of that is likely to be kind of physiological, that we differ from one another in terms of how strong those physiological reactions are, and therefore how kind of obvious they are to us and how likely they are to bother us. But the kind of cognitive interpretation comes from what children learn about them. So the way we talk to children about what they feel when they feel scared or worried, or what we feel when we feel scared or worried, and what they observe us doing as adults, as parents in particular. So, you know, children are like sponges. They're always learning from the people around them. So the way that we react and the way we talk about those things will teach them how they should react and how they should talk about them. And similarly, almost all of us have a little bit of uncertainty or anxiety around things that are new. So if you've never felt your heart racing until you're, you know, 12 years old and you're faced with a test at school, and suddenly you feel this sensation in your chest that you've never felt before, that's way more anxiety provoking and way more likely to lead to, oh my goodness, I'm having a heart attack, than if that's a sensation you've experienced multiple times because you've experienced it whilst you've been having fun and playing, and therefore you know that it's not anything to worry about. So that's kind of the point, I guess, is that children need to be exposed to these feelings early on in life to learn not to be scared of them. Otherwise, they become these new scary things later on. The other thing you asked was about, so I'm not suggesting that adventurous play should be used as a therapy. Okay, this is all about prevention, right? So I'm not suggesting that we take children who are clinically anxious and get them to, you know, go climb a cliff. I don't think that is going to be hugely helpful. It would just be terrifying for them. But it's more about, as I was saying, the environment that children are growing up in being one that supports their mental health. And so if we are restricting their time outdoors, their time in nature, their opportunity to take risks, their opportunity to play adventurously, then we increase their risk for anxiety. Whereas if we provide plenty of opportunities for that kind of play as children are growing up, then they shouldn't become anxious in the first place. So it's not really about does it become more or less effective as they get older. It's arguably perhaps more important when they're young, because that's when they're having those first early learning experiences. But I think actually it's useful throughout development, partly because it as a reminder, and also because we change and we get different things from the same learning opportunities, right? You know, you can experience something when you're 5 and again when you're 10 and again when you're 15, and you get totally different things from it. So I don't think that it's something, you know, where we should only be talking about young children. And I think actually, you know, there's a lot of work about adolescents taking risks and adolescent mental health problems. So if adolescents have opportunity to take risks through their play in a relatively safe way, then they may be less likely, to take risks in, you know, difficult ways, because they have that desire to take risks. So why not let them build an assault course on adventure playgrounds and have fun with that, rather than deciding they're going to try out shoplifting or drugs or something, as a way of expressing that need to take risks. So I think that it's important throughout, but I think it's slightly different as kids get older.
Thanks, Helen. We've had quite a few questions about how, because I don't know if you know actually, but we're in quite a strict lockdown again in Malaysia, and the FMCO. And so we've had quite a few questions about how parents can encourage adventurous play within the home setting, and also how much of the benefits of adventurous play are about the social interaction with others. And therefore, what do you do when your child is an only child?
Yeah. I don't think that the benefits, I'm going to take that bit first and then I'll come back to at home. I don't think the benefits require social interaction. It's really about the child being in that, having that experience. I think what happens in the social interaction is you get the encouragement to keep going when you might be feeling a bit unsure. And it feels perhaps more exciting and more of a positive experience if you're sharing it together. But only children can definitely have adventurous experiences and learn from them. In terms of it happening at home, obviously there are restrictions, in terms of what you can do when you're at home. My own children seem to have managed to do it in some ways. So, I mean, I guess perhaps it's different with the climate. So we've got a trampoline in the garden. Trampolines are great for adventurous play. So, test out, can I do this, somersault, or can I do whatever? And then another thing that they do a lot is, building assault courses and things in the house. So taking cushions off the sofa or getting out the chairs and then they'll climb, they'll set each other a challenge, like, can I get from one side of the house to the other without touching the floor? And they've got to kind of create things in between. So I think there are ways of doing it if you're willing for your children to play with the furniture. Often it requires. And the other thing to keep in mind is that it's not the end of the world if kids have a month when they don't do it. This is about their sort of long-term learning opportunities. So if a child, is not given opportunities to play adventurously for the first, 6 years of their life, then they might struggle, if they're suddenly in a situation where they do feel uncertain and are out of their comfort zone. But if they don't do it for a month, nothing terrible is going to happen. It's more important that they have play opportunities, right? So some of those might be adventurous if you manage to make that work, but it's much more important that they have downtime where they're leading, they're doing whatever they want to do, and that you try and kind of think about that sort of play diet. So yes, what they might want to do is just go on a screen and play a computer game. If they want to do that, give them time to do that, let them do that, but with a sort of end point. And then after that, you're going to go find something else to do that doesn't involve a screen, and then let them explore. But just kind of giving that time for free play and giving them some autonomy and some control over what it is that they're doing.
That segues beautifully to the next little set of questions, which is about, say that you have children who haven't had opportunities to do adventurous play or are a little bit reticent to do it themselves. How could a parent encourage that sort of play? And culturally in Malaysia, I think it's fair to say that play is not prioritised, and one of the questions has come from a current student, Henry, about how we can change people's perceptions about the need for play and the need for children to develop these skills.
Yeah. What was the first part?
How you encourage children to do adventurous play.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because some children will do this regardless of what you do as a parent, and you kind of almost have to rein them in a little bit because they kind of will take it too far, and others don't naturally do it quite so much. So yeah, I think the thing to be careful of is pushing too hard. So I once saw a parent pushing a 2-year-old up a climbing wall, and they had their hand at their bum, and this child was crying and clearly didn't want to go up the climbing wall, and they were just pushing, and it was not what good parenting looks like. I don't think it was insensitive to what the child needed at that point. But but I think you can say, well, why don't you give this a go, or how do you feel about trying that? I think you could do it, and kind of giving some encouragement about, I reckon you're big enough now that you might be able to manage that. Like, why don't you give it a go? And I'll be here. Like, don't worry. I'm going to be here if you decide you don't want to do it. Ultimately, it needs to be the child's decision to do it. But I think you can give some, oh, I've got an idea, something that we haven't really done before that might be really fun. Why don't we try this out? And it's kind of doing it step by step so that you're not then kind of going straight to, right, well, you never play in this way, but now I'm expecting you to do this. It's like, let's just kind of, it's about the edges of that comfort zone, right? So for each child, the edge of the comfort zone is in a different place. And so working out, well, where's the edge for your child, and pushing them within that, but in a supportive way. And if they say no and want to stop, then they stop, because it's not play otherwise, right? If you're telling them to do it, then it stops being play. And then how can we sort of change attitudes? So we have a PhD student actually who's working on kind of parent focused stuff and thinking about parent attitudes and to play and how we do that. So there are some kind of like educational online things that parents can watch to learn more about play. But the problem is, obviously, the parents who tend to watch them are the ones who already think that play is important. So I think partly it's about that kind of, it's almost sort of a public health campaign. So if you think about a kind of anti-smoking campaign or an anti-speeding campaign, it's a campaign around children need to be outdoors, they need to be in contact with nature, and they need opportunity to play, and that these things benefit children. So part of the reason that we're doing the kind of Summer of Play campaign this year is that in England there's been so much focus on the educational catch-up, that they've missed out on their education, and we're kind of saying, well, yes, they have, but they've also missed out on a whole chunk of playing with their friends and being outdoors and being active. So that's a kind of public facing campaign in the media where we're trying to get people to just stop and think, actually, maybe children need play. So I think it's that kind of thing, but it's really chipping away at it. I don't think that there will be a thing that suddenly happens that changes people's perspective. But also I think schools have a role to play in terms of messaging around, the importance of play. If schools are seen to be prioritising play, then parents are more likely to think, oh, actually, maybe this is important as well. So I think it's a kind of public health message, and it's also an educational message in terms of that play has its place. Also, I haven't talked really at all about sort of play-based learning, but play is a fantastic tool to use in education as well. So yeah, I think that there are ways of doing it, but it is just kind of chipping away. These changes don't happen overnight.
Brilliant. So with an eye on the time, I'm going to ask one last sort of little mini set of questions, which is about adult play, because we've been focusing on children and anxiety. But what about adults? When do adults stop playing? Do they ever stop playing? And have you got any recommendations for university students about the kind of adventurous play that they could do, which might help them experience these thrills in a safe way?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't think anybody stops playing. I think there's a quote that the opposite of play is depression. And so, play is fun, and it's about you doing something which you want to do. So, you know, it looks very, very different for different adults. Like for some adults, play is knitting, right? And for others, it's mountain biking. And for others, you know, it might be playing football, or, you know, and so I think it's about finding things that you value and that you enjoy doing and that make you feel good. So you're not doing them because it looks good on your CV. You're not doing them because your boss told you to. You're not doing them because you have to. It's a course requirement. You're doing it simply because you want to do it. So in terms of kind of getting those thrilling, exciting feelings, you know, when you're stuck at home, then there's quite a lot of restriction there. We've done, I don't know if they've kind of taken off in Malaysia, we've done quite a lot of like online escape rooms and things like that, you know, and then the clock's ticking and you've got to solve the puzzle, and that's been quite good for kind of just getting some kind of feeling of excitement. But then other than that, I'd be thinking about things like adventure sport. Things like rock climbing or kayaking, or like wild swimming is something that's taken off lots. Surfing, paddleboarding, like, you know, it feels slightly different to kind of children's play because it tends to be a sort of organised activity that you go along to do, but it can absolutely still give you those feelings of like being at the edge of your comfort zone and those kind of feelings of uncertainty and arousal. And often people describe that as really feeling alive, you know, that in that moment. And that can then lead to these really sort of positive feelings of like accomplishment and challenge, and which might be a really nice balance to the sort of academic stress and studying and, you know, more sort of book work. So yeah, when you're allowed to, I think, yeah, look out for those opportunities, but only if you're listening to this and thinking, yeah, actually I'd really like to do something like that. Like if you're somebody who likes watching films and reading books, then do that, right? You know, it's not that everybody needs to be out doing things that are super adventurous. But I do think even when you're somebody who doesn't necessarily seek out those opportunities, when you are in them, if it isn't too far out of your comfort zone, you still get some benefit from doing it. You know, I might not like going on a long bike ride, but actually if I do it, I feel good afterwards. So I think still pushing the edges of your comfort zone somewhere can be beneficial as an adult as well. I think that's until you're, you know, in your hundreds. I don't think it goes away.
I think that's a really lovely place to finish. And actually, as you were talking about adult adventurous play, I was thinking my husband over the pandemic has taken up skateboarding with the kids, and he keeps coming back with grazes on his knees, and I'm teasing him about a midlife crisis, but it is adventurous play, so that's what he's doing.
Brilliant. It makes us feel alive, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So thank you, Helen, for a really, really interesting talk. Thank you to the audience for coming. I hope that we managed to get through enough of your questions for you to be satisfied. We do have a whole week of events to celebrate the psychology centenary, our 100 years of psychology at Reading, and when we go, there'll be slides up with the details for that. We also have an additional event on the 2nd of July on the future of psychology in Malaysia, which will be a panel discussion. So please follow us on Facebook, Instagram and LinkedIn for further details. So again, thank you very much to Helen for a really, really interesting, fascinating talk. Thank you to the audience, and I will say goodbye. Thank you.